"O my queen," said the royal sorcerer to Hatshepsut, "with this amulet, you and your descendants are endowed by the goddess Isis with the powers of the animals and the elements. You will soar as the falcon soars, run with the speed of gazelles, and command the elements of sky and earth." 3,000 years later, a young science teacher dug up this lost treasure and found she was heir to the secrets of Isis. And so, unknown to even her closest friends, Rick Mason and Cindy Lee, she became a dual person, Andrea Thomas, teacher,
Almighty Isis,
and Isis, dedicated foe of evil, defender of the weak, champion of truth and justice.
are you all right?
Oh, sure. What can happen to the Queen of the Uglies?
That's a terrible thing to say. You should stop putting yourself down that way.
Welcome back, everyone, to an all-new episode of the Shazam Isis podcast. It's your old mentor, John S. Drew here, and we're continuing our journey down the highways and byways of the land, revisiting those two television shows we loved so much during the mid-1970s, Shazam and The Secrets of Isis. And joining me here on this journey, as he's been since the very beginning, is the Big Red Cheese himself, Mr. Richard F. Lee. Hey, Richard.
Well, hello, Dr. John. I was going to run for student body president, but I feel really ugly.
Oh, Richard, you know that only ugliness is really inside.
Oh, that really cheers up my self.
That's the 2017 cynic in me.
I'll have to do the Stuart Smalley thing then. I'm good enough, I'm smart enough, and doggone it, people like me, I
Exactly.
guess.
There you go. So, how are you?
We're doing great over here on the west part of the country, the coast here. I know you're on the east coast as we get ready to gear up for a brand new set of reviews. Isn't it great that here we are on two different parts of the country, two sides of the country, able to keep alive the memory of a fun set of television shows, Shazam and Isis.
Yeah, it really is. It really is. And, you know, it's funny because I think about, like, why couldn't I have had this when I was in my teens or 20s?
Well, back in my teens and 20s, I was a little too concentrated thinking about other things. If we spent too much time talking about Shazam and Isis Hour as a sophomore in high school, we would really have problems with our self-esteem. They would beat it into us, I would think.
I think you're right.
Yeah, you know, when we became teenagers, we were supposed to put away all the things we enjoyed as kids, which really were only a few years earlier when you think about it.
Yeah.
And like, oh, for heaven's sakes. Now here we are in our 50s, 60s, 70s, however old we really are, I don't know, reviewing stuff that goes back in the past by decades. And part of me is cynical, too. Part of me thinks and believes that the creators and the actors of the shows that we enjoy so much are doing the William Shatner thing and saying, get a life, move out of your parents' basement.
Yeah.
And here I am at 50 going to myself, hey, I like my parents' basement, okay?
I'm sitting in my basement at the moment. It's the only place I can podcast in silence.
Great.
But you know, that's the other thing, too. This would never have flown, you're right, in the 80s when we were sophomores in high school and such. It was one of those things that maybe if somebody made a joke about Captain Marvel or Isis, and suddenly for a few brief moments you're like, oh, yeah, I remember that as a kid, but then, hey, but we're too cool for that now. It was the same thing with me. I could never express among a large crowd my love of the 60s Batman show, because by the 80s they're all, oh, he's the Dark Knight,
Yes.
Adam West isn't cool. And look at it now, the full circle and the love and the embracing that goes on with this show and with Shazam and Isis.
Of course, it goes for anything that you liked as a kid, but amazingly also, if you want to tie that into what older generations of people think, people who are in their 70s and 80s reminisce about how cool the Lone Ranger was or something from decades ago. And it's because we really like the things that we grew up with, even though there's a stage in our life where we say, yeah, it's not cool, let's move on to something more adult. And you find yourself thinking, you know, the things that we enjoyed in the past were really good. Let's go back and watch them again. And that brings us to Shazam and Isis.
That brings us to Shazam and Isis, brings us to our episode today. But before we can get to that, we got to talk about the next issue in the 1970s DC Comics line. And this is a review of issue number 6. The story is called The Ominous Ooze, and it's by the usual creative team of Jack Harris, Mike Vosberg, and Vince Colletta. Now, I can tell you right off the bat.
Ooze.
Sorry?
Ominous Ooze. Yeah. What a title, John. Ominous Ooze.
Yeah.
I love it.
Well, I love this comic book for a number of reasons. First and foremost, it's the only one I owned as a kid.
Really, this is the first issue of the Mighty Isis you ever laid eyes on.
It was the only issue of the Mighty Isis I laid eyes on, because when I started trying to make an effort, and this was before the days of comic book stores, trying to find it on the newsstands, I couldn't find it. And by the time, I might have had a chance to get it, it was too late because we only had 2 more issues after that.
Yes, you're right.
Yeah.
And in those days, most of us bought comic books probably at a drugstore, at the rack of the grocery store, or something like that. And that's how we did it. And comic book stores would not come into vogue around, the early 80s. I remember the first comic book store was a place that's still around in Seattle. Our podcast listeners may know about it if they're from Seattle. It's called Golden Age Collectibles. It's located at the Pike Place Market. And they had comic books and autographs galore. And for those who were looking for back issues, that would have been the place to be. So had you lived in that area, you could have gone back and actually acquired issues 1 through 5. So you would have been able to know what went on in the Mighty Isis comic book just some issues earlier. But you're right, at that time, it was very difficult to locate comic books. And if you missed a past issue, you would not have really have known where you could possibly have acquired them.
Yeah. And what also stood out to me was the ooze. I was fascinated with The Blob, the movie from the 1950s. And then I see this comic where, even as a kid, I was kind of like, oh my gosh, they're ripping off The Blob.
Yes. I remember The Blob with Steve McQueen.
Yep.
And I didn't make the connection like that you did. I didn't make the connection yet. But when you think about it, if you were familiar with the Shazam comic also, there was an issue around close to the same time that this issue came out where Captain Marvel is fighting a blob also.
Really?
Yeah. Only that case it was a dessert that kept expanding. And so people were given spoons to eat it before it got too big. Now that was one of the silliest stories I've ever read, but it was kind of cool. You're eating this dessert that keeps expanding like the blob. It gets bigger and bigger and bigger. And you got to wonder for a second, where is it going if you're eating it? Okay. Hadn't the writer thought of that? Oh, but we digress again. The Blob.
Well, hang on, because I mean, we are the Shazam Isis podcast, so it's fair game. And now you've got me thinking and wondering. Isis went and took a more darker, dare I say, even more grown-up turn with the storytelling and such. Meanwhile, here's Captain Marvel, and he's fighting off an expanding dessert. Do you think part of the problem with Captain Marvel was they didn't know how to fit him into what was turning into a more grown-up DC universe with stories when you had the more fantastical ones and the characters such as, because wasn't Mr. Tawny and such part of the comic book?
Oh, absolutely he was. They brought him back from that golden age. And so you're right, Captain Marvel in the comic could not really adjust to the darker tone of the DC universe. He couldn't. So they kept the ridiculous humor, although I don't think you would have found a story like the expanding dessert in the 1940s versions of Captain Marvel, but the humor was still there, and I read it as a kid, and I thought this was silly. And I think that's what turned off those types of storylines, turned off C.C. Beck. But that's the direction that DC wanted to go with the character. They wanted to keep him silly, but he wasn't fitting into the new age of things turning darker and cynical. Like Denny O'Neil helped take the Batman character and wanted to bury and forget about the 1966 Adam West show and turned the character into something much darker, more serious. He became the Dark Knight detective. And then there was Isis that you're reading about here in issue 6. She's taking on a darker tone also. You note that there's several killings that happen in this episode or in this issue of the comic book.
Yeah, no, I mean, this issue of the comic book has deaths. Even the cover itself is striking because we see the skeletal remains of something the ooze consumed. Based on the way it's lying down, it's funny because it could look like an animal based on the rib cage they show, but then it looks like a human skull there as well. So you're like, oh my God, maybe it's a guy who was walking his big dog.
Yeah. They could not have shown that in the TV show.
No. Or for that matter, the ooze itself, as it's moving in on Rick Mason and Andrea's mother, and there's Isis trying to zap it away. And the ooze is, the best way to describe it, it's surrounding her and cupping her butt, which I remember vividly as an 8-year-old kid.
Well, your mind has always been in the gut, John. Hey, but who am I to interfere with your version of a pinup girl, okay?
The basic story is this biological weapon has been developed. They can create this biological ooze that is able to consume anything organic. And when I say they, and this is the other more adult story, because it takes a political angle. It's been developed by this Arab group, and they want to use it as a weapon.
Yes, it's true. There is a political angle to this. There is reference to these Arabs. And the camel gets consumed by the ooze in this issue.
Yep.
Animal deaths. I can handle all the human deaths in the world, but you're killing off a poor camel.
Yeah.
And keeping up with the changes that occurred, in the past couple of issues, triangles form around Isis's hands when she's using her magic powers.
Right.
Triangles.
Mm-hmm.
Little pyramids.
I also feel that the art is getting better for this.
Yes, the art looks really good.
Yeah.
It actually captures the essence of the actors who played the characters without really looking exactly like them.
Right. Well, Rick Mason still has that pencil-thin mustache instead of a fuller one like Brian Cutler had.
Yeah.
Yeah. But I really like this whole thing because, we continue the story with Rick and he's trying to track down Andrea. So his first thing is go find her mother and see if she's heard from her. And it all ties in together because the Arabs have come to the United States and they unleash the ooze in Andrea's hometown.
This is long before anthrax, folks. They were going to unleash ooze. But the transition in the story is really neat, where here you have Isis overseas in Egypt somewhere, and then she says to herself, I wonder what science teacher Andrea Thomas would do in this case. So you see that Isis and Andrea Thomas, reinforcing in the reader's minds, are not the same person anymore. They're two separate people.
Yeah. And it's funny, too, because at the end of the story, when Isis meets Rick and her mother, Andrea's mother, after saving them from the ooze, and Isis makes the mistake when Rick says, do you know where Andrea is? And she goes, I can't tell you. It's not, I don't know. I can't tell you. So Rick jumps to the conclusion Isis may have something to do with Andrea's disappearance. And in a sinister way.
That's really a dark tone, because Isis is the most trusted character in this fictional universe, at least in the TV show. And now you have the comic book have main characters turn against the heroine.
Right.
Isis herself. That's pretty dark. I don't know if that's comparable with, say, how in the TV show, in earliest episodes of Batman, where Chief O'Hara had his misgivings about Batman, at least.
Right.
And you can think of that in the comic book. Why would any of these characters who would have known who Isis was for so long take a turn against her? Very different tone.
Very different tone. And you mentioned the camel at the beginning. Well, our three main bad guys get consumed by the ooze as well.
Well, they deserve it.
But it's still a dark tone, seeing, humans being devoured. I mean, I know what you're saying, and there's a lot of people I agree with. I think animals being killed and tortured sometimes are worse than certain humans. God help me, but it's still horrific for a comic book, and especially for Isis. I mean, the most we've dealt with death so far in either show is Lucky.
Yeah, and again, the powers of Isis couldn't save a camel, and they couldn't save Lucky either.
You're never going to get over Lucky, are you?
I'll never get over Lucky, but we got Ooze to look forward to, right?
We got Ooze to look forward to. And again, that whole tone also, she's got that whole arrogance to her, Isis, that she didn't have at the beginning of the comic book, and she certainly doesn't have in the TV series as she's talking to anyone, including Rick Mason and Andrea's mother.
Oh, absolutely. And the tone of the character is so off here in the comic book. She acts like a common trope that you see in television and in comic book episodes and issues is to see a goddess or a god having power over mere mortal humanity and showing it by arrogance. And in this issue, Isis acts really dark and off character. Mm-hmm. She grabs a guy by the lapels and calls him, "You rash mortal." Like, wow, this is so different. And then she tosses him on the ground. This is dark. Standards and practices would not allow this for the TV show.
But she does, at least, and this is the nice thing, it's not like these writers like Jack Harris didn't sit there and go, oh, well, she's a goddess, this is the way she acts, without realizing the roots, because Isis stops herself every once in a while. She did last issue and says, what am I doing? I don't normally act like this. She questions herself. So I do like that. It's like, okay, if you're going to introduce this dark element, don't have it come out of left field. Have it in such a way that it's organic. And as disturbing as it is to you and me, who know Isis in the TV show and even the early issues of the comic, at least it's a progression that works, even if we don't like it. Yeah,
it's a progression that might work, but you're right. I don't really like how they're treating the character here. I can see probably why they're doing it, because they want to make her interesting and fit into the new DC universe where supposedly this is how realistically people behave in real life, I guess. Mm-hmm. But could this be a harbinger of why the mighty Isis ended after a few issues?
It's possible, but it's interesting because it goes back to what we were talking about before. They tried to make Isis, who wasn't even a DC Universe character, fit into the DC Universe. They didn't make as much of an effort with Captain Marvel.
Yep, you're right. But for whatever reason, Captain Marvel managed to survive in the DC Universe, even though he had his own issues for a while too. But they kept his story going. Isis, they shelved. They killed her off for a few years. They brought her back in the New 52 and in other recreations or reboots of the character. So she's lingering out there somewhere, but she disappeared for the longest time from DC's menagerie of characters.
Right. Yeah. Now, like you said, we've only got a couple of more issues before the comic series is canceled. But interestingly enough, if you read the letters page, this must have come out of the blue for them, because they're talking in this issue about Captain Marvel going to be making an appearance in the comic book to sort of return the favor for Isis appearing in his.
Yes. At this point, they didn't have plans to cancel this comic. They wanted it to continue. They had plans for it. They had good plans for it to last indefinitely. And I believe the episodes of Isis was still on the air at this time in first run. They weren't finished with the show yet.
Right.
So in the progression of the comic, Rick Mason goes all the way to Missouri to look for Andrea's mother, thinking that Andrea fled back home. We talked about in prior episodes of the podcast, where in the comic book did they situate these characters? And we're told that the mother believes it was California.
Mm-hmm.
So I think we've established, I believe so, there might be some inconsistencies in the past few issues, but the high school is in California, just like the TV show. What were they thinking? Let's be more consistent with the TV show. We've established he's out somewhere in Cali as opposed to the East Coast or wherever else. There are some things that appear to be consistent.
As I say, it still reminds me of my childhood. I didn't have my original issue when we decided to start talking about the comics, so I had to go out and buy it. Here's the thing. I don't know if I just wasn't keeping track or what the deal was. I can't remember. But now I've suddenly wound up with two copies of issue 6.
Is one of those copies the original one you possessed?
No, that's what I'm saying. I didn't have it. That's why. I went out and I started getting. I was looking for the best deals, but for some reason I wound up with a second copy of issue 6. So that's
okay.
Yeah. So what I'd like to propose is this. I don't need 2 copies of issue 6 as much as it brings back such great memories of my childhood and all. I think I can let one go safely. So what I'd like to do is offer our fans listening to the podcast an opportunity to get the copy. All you got to do, very simple. If you're on Facebook, like us on Facebook. Well, you don't follow us on Facebook. You're not on Facebook. Okay? Go to Twitter. Follow us on Twitter. Shazam Isis Pod is where we're tagged on Twitter. But okay, I don't have Twitter. Simple. Then send us an email. ShazamIsisPodcast@gmail.com. Not the Shazam Isis Podcast. It's just ShazamIsisPodcast@gmail.com. Send us an email. Let us know you're listening and let us know you like the issue. Those folks who like us, including those who currently like us, because I always hate that when they say, oh, this contest is for new likes. No. Everybody who's liked Shazam Isis Podcast on Facebook, everybody who follows us on Twitter, you're in the contest already. Now, new people, you can get in on this too by liking us on Twitter and Facebook or by emailing us and letting us know you listen to the podcast. So this way we also get a better idea of who's out there and who's listening. One last thing you can also do is you can comment on the episode over at the ShazamIsisPodcast.com page and let us know there you're a fan. I will pick one person at random. I'm just going to put them all the names into a data file and have it pick one at random, and that person will win the copy of the Mighty Isis number 6. Now, it's September as we do this, so basically what I'm going to do is this. The end of September, September 30th, is the closing date for this contest. We'll take no new entries after that, and then on our first October show, we'll announce the winner. Sounds good?
This sounds wonderful. Now, for the benefit of our podcast listeners, because this is going to be archived in the future, that's September 30th, 2017.
Yeah.
Yes. September 30th, 2017. So if you're listening to this in the year 2027, you're kind of late, okay?
Yeah, you're kind of late.
But if you do win this issue of the Mighty Isis, issue number 6, you can enjoy also, like I am, page 13, where you can have the offer in your own hands for the bionic hand that you can control, earn money, and rush $1 to someplace in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. You're going to be guaranteed to like this. Or you can buy a switchblade comb. Or you can get a bionic heat transfer iron-on. Now, you have to go back in time, back to 1976, when those offers would have been good, but nevertheless, you'll have an issue where you'll be able to see these old-fashioned ads for the most ridiculous things in the world that you could spend money on.
Well, thank you for pointing that out. I got to get a scan of that and put it up on my OSI Files podcast page.
It is. Now, I say that in part because this is attached to the times, 1976, when the bionic shows were very popular, that it never occurred to me that advertisers would be using the word bionic to sell merchandise on these ads. bionic hand that you can control, bionic iron-on heat transfer. Amazing, amazing. So it's a step into the past, what people were into. Now, if you're a real perv, like John and me, you could buy the X-ray specs that you can wear and look through people's clothing. Again, that's on page 13. Now, since we're looking at an old issue of a comic book, how many of you out there are old enough to remember advertisements for X-ray specs? And did you ever order those with the hopes that you were going to be able to look through clothing? Okay. You can buy an old issue or get an old issue of the Mighty Isis if you participate in this comic contest that we've got, and you can take a step or a walk back through memory lane.
So make sure, folks, September 30th, 2017, final day to get in your email or to get in your likes on Twitter and Facebook, or to leave us a comment over at ShazamIsisPodcast.com. So, Richard, let's move along to our review of our next episode of Isis. We're getting towards the end of the first season. What are we talking about this time?
Well, in this review of the Shazam Isis podcast, we are going to be looking at an episode called Funny Gal. This episode, Funny Gal, first aired on November 22nd, 1975. It was directed by Hollingsworth Morse and written by Sid Morse. And I'm assuming that Sid Morse and Hollingsworth Morse were related.
It's a good guess. I mean, Morse isn't a common name.
No, not a common name, and they happen to be working on the same show, but it's not exactly like Smith and Jones.
Right. Now, we've got a guest cast here. We've got Sandra Vasey as Carrie Anson, our funny gal. Jonas Agee, am I saying that name right, you think?
I think so. We're relying entirely on Internet Movie Database for our information, and we just go off of what we say there, or we're relying on the DVD insert too.
Right. He plays Greg Alley.
I'm more concerned about where the writers come up with these last names.
Yeah. And our guest star on this is John Davey himself as Captain Marvel. This is going to be the first crossover episode of Isis featuring Captain Marvel. The third season would have the second and third guest appearances of Captain Marvel.
Yes. And what was so important in these crossover episodes, they were cross-promoting each other's shows.
Right.
So in order to get viewers to watch Isis, they could throw in Captain Marvel into an Isis episode because Captain Marvel had a built-in fan base. And, of course, Isis was introduced on the Shazam show. And that type of cross-promotion is still done to this day. I remember back in the 1970s, they introduced the character Mork on an episode of Happy Days, and he was not really meant to be a spin-off character. But he had his own show with Robin Williams that was very popular, and the new shows emerged where they used Robin Williams to introduce the new show, and because of that cross-promotion, you take a different actor from an established, popular show, you could probably get viewers for it. And I suspect that was needed for this episode. It wasn't about really, let's face it, it's not about the dilemma that the teenager of the week has. It was really about trying to cross-promote the shows.
Yeah. And I'll always point out that long before we give credit to $6 Million Man and Bionic Woman for crossing over our favorite hero shows. I mean, I know there were other shows that did crossover things. I mean, it was never as big a deal as we seem to think of it as kids in the 70s. But Captain Marvel, Shazam, and Isis had their crossovers first in 1975.
Yes, that's right. Long before Lee Majors and Lindsay Wagner did that kind of thing. You're right about that, John. It never occurred to me. It's just that $6 Million Man and Bionic Woman were prime time. They had bigger budgets, and people tend to be more familiar with them.
Right.
These two shows people are not as familiar with, but you're right. These shows cross-promoted. And they did it on even a low budget for Saturday morning, and it worked.
Yeah.
I think Isis eventually got more viewers than Shazam, actually, in time.
I wouldn't be surprised. I mean, Bionic Woman eventually got more viewers than $6 Million Man did.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering, was the viewers because the guys were really turned on by good-looking women, or was it because this is an empowerment show for young girls who had a hero to look up to?
I think it was a little of both. And again, I'm also, now that I'm thinking about it, Xena did better than Hercules.
Mm-hmm.
As far as numbers, audience numbers. They recently, although they just canceled the plans for it, NBC was going to bring Xena back.
Wow.
But they just canceled the plans. Now, when it came to Buffy and Angel, I think Buffy always had the upper hand there, but she came first anyway.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
That's true. So here we are in this episode where we see our teenager of the week, Carrie.
Hey, Carrie!
Greg, dear boy!
What are you dressed up for this
I
time?
am the ghost of the past and the spirit of the now.
Could be. You do look a little spooky. Hey, listen, speaking of ghosts, I thought you were going to become one at the Destruction Derby last Saturday. I never figured you'd get out in one piece.
Don't be silly. With all this blubber I carry around, they couldn't hurt me.
I don't know why I bother with you. You're hopeless.
My lovely!
What are you going to do next?
Oh, something worthy of my palace.
Carrie, you are a nut. But you're a million laughs. I'll catch you later.
Later. Nice to know somebody's happy.
So hence my introduction of this episode of the podcast with having low self-esteem. I'm trying to tie this in together, John.
Yeah.
That you said ugliness is within. I would not have told that to Carrie. That's something Greg should have said to her in the first place. Oh, don't put yourself down, Carrie. You're only ugly on the inside.
Yeah, this is definitely, and we still see it to this day, even though I think, as for the most part, I think we're people who are more accepting of other people. We're certainly into, pointing out when there's body shaming going on and such, but very common back then that and I think to a certain extent, you and I may have done it. I know I did. I'd commonly put myself down because it's easier to do that and sort of like blame yourself than let anybody else attack you. If you think about it, you're saving them the trouble, or maybe you're at least putting up that barrier so everyone's like, oh, wow, this kid puts himself down. I ain't going to put him down. Do you know what I mean?
Right. Yes, I do. I know what you mean.
Yeah. So we see Andrea. She's working on an experiment as Carrie is driving by, and she's got this megaphone, and she's kind of weaving in and out as she's doing this because she's trying to hold the megaphone and trying to drive. She loses control of her car.
Mighty Isis.
So Andrea has to rescue her. She makes the change to Isis to save her. Now, in a recent episode, you and I talked about how we want more of the hero.
Oh, zephyr winds which blow on high, lift me now so I can fly. Oh, let's see you laugh your way out of this one, fat kid.
We don't waste any time here because it's actually only the first 3 minutes into the episode.
Yeah, that's what was really strong about this episode to get started off with.
Turn back to me. Stop. Isis, wow, thanks a heap. The throttle stuck and then the steering and the brakes went out.
Are you all right?
Oh, sure. What can happen to the Queen of the Uglies?
That's a terrible thing to say. You should stop putting yourself down that way.
A person's got to be realistic.
You're not being realistic, you're just being foolish. You can't expect other people to like you unless you like yourself first.
Well, unless you know where I can get a body transplant. What's the like?
Your mind, your sense of humor. You always keep the kids laughing.
And as soon as it stops, the guys go off with the chicks. You know, the ones that look great in bikinis. Nobody cares if they got a mind.
Carrie, you are an intelligent girl. Believe me.
I'd rather not be so intelligent. If I could just be a little prettier.
It's also interesting. This is the first time we see this in the whole first season. Isis, Joanna Cameron, is doing the same flying stunt that Jackson Boswick did back in the first season by being on the truck. I'm assuming she was on some sort of a board, because you can see from the look of it that, she's dropped. The background is real and it's moving. It's not blue screen.
Yes, that was excellent. I think this is the first time we've seen this.
Mm-hmm.
So why didn't they do this a little more often? Because it would have made more sense. It would have looked realistic. They would have done away with a lot of the ridiculous blue screen or green screen, whatever they used, process shots that were excessive on the Secrets of Isis.
Well, I think a large part of it may be, if you think about it, it was easier to hide the board with Jackson's costume being all encumbering. It covered him. She's showing parts of herself. And it's a white costume. It might have been hard. They may have been working on trying how to do that stunt effectively without, one, hurting Joanna, two, making it look obvious that they were doing this. So it may have taken them a while to figure out the kind of board. I'm just guessing here. I don't know. But it was great to see.
It was great to see. You're probably right about that, but I think they could have spent a little bit of time doing it, just a few more shots, even a few more shots for process to use in future episodes, like they did with Jackson. They didn't do that every single episode. They used some of the process shots over and over again. They could have done a few more with Joanna Cameron in that, because you had natural sunlight. You had real wind. It looked a little more realistic, and it was better. And you're right. They did a quick jump cut to where she's jumping off of a ladder as she's landing. And it's very fast, and so it creates the illusion in your mind that she's just coming in for a landing without being too obvious.
It's interesting, though, because that camera shot is only on her feet.
Yes, you're right. It's only on her feet. It doesn't show her just landing. Now, they couldn't quite do it the way they did with Jackson. When Jackson jumped off a ladder, the camera was angled below, out of the range of the ladder. So he's jumping over the ladder, the camera's situated under the ladder, and he comes in with a landing, and it looked really good with the cape coming down.
Right.
If you did it with Joanna, I'm sorry, I would have loved it. You would have saw everything from North America to the North Pole when she landed, okay?
Well, the standards and practices would have to step in.
Oh, standards and practices. You have a girl dressed up in a tight mini skirt in the first place, and she comes in for a landing as that thing's flying up like Marilyn Monroe. And I'm 8 years old, and I'm going, hubba, hubba. Oh, like my prayers every night. Joanna, come rescue me. Oh,
jeez.
Okay, moving on.
Moving on. Well, we didn't avoid the blue screen altogether, because we do cut then to the blue screen as we see her make the car turn around to her and come to a stop. And it's all with cut photography on the blue screen there.
Yes.
But it's okay. It worked.
Oh, I thought it worked great, because part of this it wasn't just the obvious camera trick where they switched the photography going back with it's a process shot with blue screen or whatever.
Right.
But how she did it, how she did the incantation, how she used her hands, she allowed the acting to work for her in that scene.
Right.
And with the added music to that to make it, not the music, but the sound cue to show that a magical event happened. I thought she did great. I thought the editing on that scene was good.
Yeah, I agree. Now, when she meets up with Isis, Carrie continues to put herself down, and Isis tries to counsel her about not being so hard on herself. But it's interesting. She runs off as more of the kids now show up to investigate the accident.
Yes. She takes off. Kids come up and see her. And Isis says, "Chin's up, and I'm going to take off now." Now, to the kids' credit, they go up to see how she's doing to make sure she's all right.
Right.
They didn't rush up to Isis and go, "Isis, may I have your autograph? I've never met a superhero before." Yeah, I don't know. So next we see Rick join up with Andrea Thomas and Cindy Lee for lunch. Now, Rick did not bring any lunch of his own. He managed to mooch off the both of them.
Yeah.
Now, I watched this episode as a kid, and I'm thinking to myself, this is how I want to behave. And I have ever since, John. So if I show up, I don't have my own lunch, I'm going to be mooching off of everybody. This is a great example for a teacher to set, don't you think?
Yes, exactly.
Now, there's a great quote from this episode that I think I remember it when I know that I heard it when it first aired, and I remember it. And watching it again reminds me. The best quote from this episode.
You know something, Mr. Mason? I think you ought to get married.
I'm going to.
You are? When?
As soon as I find someone who looks like Isis and cooks like you.
If that's your attitude towards women, you're going to end up a very old and hungry bachelor.
Wow. Like, wow, play obvious here, okay?
And that whole part when she's like, you are, like, there's that little part that's surprised. There's that little part that's disappointed. Like, she plays it with a different mix of tones in her voice.
Yeah.
Yeah. I liked it.
It was good.
Yeah.
Well, Cindy then asked, what are we going to do about Carrie Anson? And, of course, again, before I go on, Cindy knows everybody in this episode.
Yeah. Well, in this series.
She knows everybody in the entire series. The teenager of the week who has problems. Cindy Lee knows them.
Knows them and butts in.
And butts in. And she knows where they hang out after school. She knows what their dilemmas are. She knows what their problems are, and brings in the other two characters of Rick and Andrea as to what are we going to do about the teenager of the week.
Yeah.
I love it. I love it. This is great. The conversation then turns about her. Andrea says this is her way of feeling significant. And Cindy suggests that a campaign be started to get Carrie elected student body president. Then Rick Mason suggests to her friend Greg to get started on the campaign. Wow. So, now this is where it gets kind of awkward. Greg says when he gets serious, she starts to clown around to keep anyone from getting too close to her. He begins to discuss how she talks about herself when Carrie herself comes in within earshot of the conversation. Now, that's a common trope, too. This happens in real life, but it's a common trope of TV shows, where a character who overhears a conversation about the character, and she hears the conversation out of context, and she says aloud that she wouldn't be dumb enough to believe that she could be the student body president. Now, doesn't this suggest that she had the idea to run in the first place?
Well, you know, that's the thing. She may have had that idea and immediately put herself down. It's that defense mechanism. Rather than letting you hurt me, I'll hurt myself because it won't be as painful.
Yeah, you're right. I've seen this time and time and time again. And I think some of us with low self-esteem have done that to ourselves. Yeah. God knows I do all the time. Well, hey, in my case, everybody talks about me. It doesn't matter if I overhear it or not. Like, okay, talk about Richard today. But this is true. I think all of us may have been in situations like this in real life. A lot of us have been.
Yeah.
And what's interesting, though, because this is not a comic book where you can read the thoughts of the characters in a word balloon, the character of Carrie speaks aloud. She speaks aloud because that way the audience can hear what her thoughts are, but she has to speak aloud because you can't read a word balloon. And so this is a common trope of Shazam and Isis, where you're obviously making children's television shows here, and the kids are not going to think to themselves, hey, that's not realistic. People don't talk aloud like that to themselves. Kids are not going to think that. It's a great way for purposes of economy, to convey to the audience, here is what the thoughts are of this particular character, and the actor has to say the lines aloud because there's no word balloons.
Right. So we come to Act 2 after Carrie has overheard this, and yet we see she's into the campaign of sorts because Greg and her are working on her speech, but she's not taking it seriously again. She's showing him a balloon that she had made with the slogan saying, vote for the candidate that looks like this, which is, I don't know. It almost invites you to say, looks like what? Like fill in the blank of who she is.
Yeah.
You know?
And when I'm watching this, and I have to see myself a little bit in here because I was kind of like this as a kid. And I'm going, this is really awkward because there's so many of us who go through periods of low self-esteem, and then we end up later on in life developing enormously big egos when we overcome the self-esteem problem.
Right.
Oh, boy. So you're right. Carrie is not taking this very seriously.
No, and she goes on to suggest an eat-a-thon.
An eat-a-thon. Now, I went when I was reviewing this, having all the pizzas lined up and eat your way to the finish line, I'm going, yeah. That really is awkward. It's an awkward set of dialogue or monologue coming from her. But the sad thing is, in real life, they have these things, okay?
Yeah.
There are such things as eat-a-thons. Oh, God, what were they thinking?
I don't know.
So next, we see Carrie. She goes to see Andrea if she can talk Rick into lending her his boat. Now, just prior to that little scene, the trio, Andrea, Rick, and Cindy, are cleaning Rick Mason's boat.
Yep.
Or they're brushing it off or cleaning it up.
Rick, this is the third time you've invited us to go boating, and this is the third time we haven't even left the dock. Is this boat glued to its slip?
You don't understand. Half the fun of boating is the preparation.
Fun for who?
For whom?
Okay, fun for whom?
Look, all of this preparation is very necessary, and I promise both of you that the next time we come out here, I'll take you out into...
Rick, there's not going to be a next time.
Your slaves have just emancipated themselves.
I know what both of you need, a nice cold drink.
It's gonna take more than a cold drink to straighten out my sore back.
Cindy, you and I are two fairly intelligent young women. How did we let him con us into this 3 times in a row?
Just lucky, I guess.
There, now you relax and enjoy that, and I don't want either one of you to dare do one lick of work for at least 10 minutes.
10 minutes?
He's been out in the sun too long.
How's Carrie's campaign going?
Not too good, I'm afraid.
She seems to have this picture of herself as a washout. She just can't get rid of it.
Well, Greg's working really hard, I know that for sure.
I hope he can help her break through that barrier she's built up.
Amen to that.
Well, time's up. Let's get back to work. Hippity-hop. Hey, wait a minute. Where are you going? Come back here. That's mutiny.
This is just this little brief scene between the three of them. It's a setup where Carrie comes in to see Andrea to ask if she can talk Rick into lending Carrie Rick's boat for an idea for a publicity stunt. Oh, man. Now, I didn't know how, it's not established here, how Carrie would have known that Rick Mason has a boat, but we have to see the boat with our own eyes. I thought that was a pretty clever touch, really, in doing this episode.
Well, I mean, she might know he's got a boat if, as a teacher, he's relaying a story about it. I mean, we teachers talk about our personal lives to a certain extent. I'm always talking about my dogs in class.
Oh, God, I never talk about my personal life. It's not anybody's god-dang business. Yeah. So back here, anyway, with Carrie, she wants to borrow the boat.
Right.
So it's for the attention, we suppose. Oh, man. Now, this would have tipped off anybody who's paying close attention. She had a publicity stunt just a few moments earlier, a day earlier or so in the story.
Right.
With the car and the megaphone that went bad. Now, she wants to borrow Rick Mason's boat. So, later, we see Andrea meet up with Rick on the tennis court. And she mentions that she was delayed by Dr. Barnes. Now, yet again, it's another mention of Dr. Barnes without seeing him.
Yeah.
That, again, is a nice touch to this episode, referring to a character that has been established in prior episodes that they keep consistently throughout the run of the series without necessarily having to see the actor playing the character. No, that's nice. Again, there's some attention to detail in this one little brief scene on the tennis court. We see that Rick mentions that a storm is coming and he wanted to secure his boat. Now, good segue here into Andrea's mentioning of Carrie wanting to borrow his boat. Just as Rick says, he saw Carrie enter the marina just as he was leaving. Oh, no, you got to think for a second. What's she doing here? Oh, well, I'll go back to play. I'm going to go to the tennis court to play tennis with Andrea.
Yeah.
So she had it in her mind to steal the boat without getting permission. So Rick and Andrea quickly add up that Carrie has taken the boat without permission. Rick runs off as Andrea changes into Isis.
Almighty Isis. Oh, zephyr winds which blow on high, lift me now so I can fly.
And she did, clearly. We can see her now out on Rick's boat. She calls in a mayday to the Coast Guard, but before, because the Coast Guard's asking where you're located, she wrecks the microphone.
Mayday! Mayday! This is Carrie Anson aboard the Star Tracker 2. Mayday! Mayday!
Star Tracker, this is the Coast Guard. What is your position? I say again, Star Tracker, we read your mayday. Give us your position.
That doesn't make every newscast in town I don't deserve to be student body president. Now, just one more thing. Mr. Mason, I owe you a new microphone.
Star Tracker, this is the Coast...
Now, did you recognize who the voice is?
Was that Lou Scheimer?
Yep, that's Lou Scheimer.
This is like looking for a needle in a haystack. There's a storm moving in. We'll have to find Carrie before it hits. I guess it's time to head back now. Oh, no!
Now, I'm assuming, I think we talked about this before, this has to be in Andrea's mind. The amulet is giving her the power to see what's going on in her mind, yet the whole act is played out on the amulet. She can't be reading her own amulet to see what it's showing her because it's on her forehead.
Yeah.
Oh, gosh. But all right, as a kid, I bought it. Okay, I believe those things can happen.
Yeah.
So as Carrie attempts to get the boat started, a fire starts on it.
Yeah.
And she sees somehow there is a hole and starts to bail out this boat. Oh, dear. Going from bad to worse.
Yeah. Yeah. Now, there's an interesting little scene here really quick because Rick returns to the tennis court to find Cindy waiting for him, and he makes the comment of how every time there's an emergency, Andrea disappears.
Oh, now that's okay. I suppose that's okay to say that. I suppose it's all right, but I don't know if it's really necessary for the writers to have put that in every single time. Because they did that other than this episode.
Yeah.
Every time, or they would say at the end, every time Isis is here, Andrea's gone. You missed all the action.
Right.
Oh, gee. That became a little cliche-ish after a while. So I don't know if that line was altogether that necessary. Oh, but oh well.
It's the problem with the whole setup, because if you think about it, with Captain Marvel, they moved on. So it's like, okay, let everybody say, hey, where was Billy? Billy's like, I went to go do this. Get in the RV and drive off. Whereas with Isis, you've got the same characters all the time. So after a while, they're going to start questioning it. The problem is, like you say, they keep asking it and nobody puts two and two together.
And even in the comic book, no one's going to put two and two together. Okay?
No.
Now this is interesting. We were mentioning a moment ago about how the first appearance of Isis, you had the neat setup of Isis flying apparently on top of a truck where the camera is situated where it is a very realistic flying shot, and then Andrea or Isis landing with a camera on her feet as though she just landed on the ground. We get treated to that again.
Yeah. Yeah. It's a natural landing.
Landing, like you said, a natural landing. Yeah. That was great.
Yeah.
I don't quite know how they did that. I think it was quick editing. She looks like she really landed on that one. It's not just a camera focusing on her feet. She lands on that boat.
She lands on that boat. She's got the heels she's wearing. It's a boat. It's not it's on water. I really appreciated the effort that went into that. It's a stunt.
Yes. And I wish that every episode of Isis would do that. It was good.
Yeah.
Isis, thank goodness. I can't get the motor started and there's a leak in the boat. I pulled a really dumb stunt this time and I'm in a lot of trouble.
More than you know, Carrie. There's a storm coming in, and I can't help you here and stop the storm. I'm gonna need a little help on this one. Tut, hear me, and take to flight. Now to find Captain Marvel. There he is. Tut, bring Captain Marvel. I need him. Fly due west. Hang in there, Carrie. Help's on the way.
Thank you, Isis.
Now to see about holding off that storm. Oh, zephyr winds which blow on high, lift me now so I can fly.
So, wouldn't anyone familiar with both Tut and Andrea Thomas wonder what the connection was that Tut had with Isis? Okay? He could be potentially worse than Bat-Mite, all right?
Looks like a little housework is needed here.
He happens to be Captain Marvel. He's not Billy in the RV. And we're going to see this again next season when Captain Marvel guest stars in 2 other episodes.
Right.
Now, out of a 24-hour day, how many hours does Billy be Captain Marvel? He's usually called upon to be Captain Marvel at least once a day. He's Captain Marvel for 2 minutes.
Yeah. Tut, what is it? Did Isis send you? Does she need me? Which way is she? West of here. All right, Tut, I'll take care of it from here.
What I find interesting here is that Captain Marvel understands Tut. Does he understand crow speak?
Well, that's the thing. Why doesn't Tut speak? Is he only a mimicking bird? I mean, I'm pretty sure we've seen examples of him saying something.
We have to hold that storm back until Captain Marvel arrives to help Carrie. Oh, mighty storm that rolls so free, now roll back, calm the sea.
The storm seems to be letting up.
Isis is holding back the storm as she's waiting for Captain Marvel. He arrives, he swoops down to the boat. We get a natural landing with him.
Of course, that's it. Isis can't hold back the storm and still bring the boat in at the same time.
Captain Marvel!
Isis sent for me. Now let's see about getting you out of here.
He grabs a rope on the boat and dives into the water, pulling the boat through the water. Obviously, he's being pulled, and he's holding onto the rope, pulling the boat. It's a whole tug thing, you know. But I'm surprised they just didn't do something with him flying and then just showing the boat being tugged, you know, from behind. Not the whole shot, obviously, but like cutting away from him flying to the boat. Do you know what I'm saying?
Yes, I know what you're saying, but it could have been done either way, because I think a boat can move a little better if it's tugged along like that. And the swimming, it didn't bother me. I think this was the producer's part where they wanted Captain Marvel to do some kind of stunt-like thing, and throwing him in the water in full costume, they wanted to make him look like he's doing some kind of adventure, something we haven't seen too much of. Now, we're going to see Captain Marvel get wet again in the 3rd season of Shazam when he goes into the water and he chases off a shark later. We're going to see the shark episode. But here, they chose to do that. Now, in a comic book advertisement, I think it shows Captain Marvel flying off and holding a kid. And in the comic book, they would have done things a lot differently. He's holding a kid as he's flying, or in the other episode of Shazam, we're going to see Captain Marvel try to pull a boat to shore by flying it, not by jumping into the water. We will see that too, but that would require more jump shots because you can't really see the character flying and holding the boat at the same time. They didn't have the special effects in those days, but you are going to see that in the future. What I find more interesting is when he finally gets to shore, Captain Marvel is dry. Okay, I'll admit, with the wind blowing all over the place, his hair can dry really fast, but he's dry.
Yeah.
Those Dan-skin tights would have held a lot of water, and the cape would have been drenched.
Right.
And the boots had to have been made of leather. You don't jump into water with leather, but they let him do it because they wanted to have an action scene with Captain Marvel. Oh, well, okay. Whatever. So what happens here? We get to the epilogue.
Yep.
And we see the characters assembled. Now we see Cindy Lee. We see Rick. We don't see Andrea, of course. We only see Isis. But we see Captain Marvel there. And you have to have typically a scene like this that wraps up everything for this episode. That's a common trope. It happens in Shazam and Isis almost all of the time. And you need to assemble the main characters, your guest episode character, for this to show the audience what lesson has the character learned. So she's learned that she's not so worthless after all, since Captain Marvel and Isis and Greg came through for her. And she also says that her second lesson was no more crazy stunts. So she's admitted off-screen to a false distress signal to the Coast Guard. Now, the damaged CB receiver was a giveaway. Carrie committed a felony and committed a gross misdemeanor of malicious mischief by destroying the CB.
Yeah.
So this ruins her chance to be student body president. I think she's going to have to withdraw from the race.
Yeah, but do you notice how it's Captain Downer who has to point out the felony?
Hey, I'm only doing my job.
Oh.
Well, it's true. I don't know. A new thought pops into my head. How would have Jackson Bostwick played the scene differently than John Davey?
I don't know if this scene could have been played differently.
Yeah, you may be right because they have to stick by the script.
Well, I don't even mean that. It's just John at this point was comfortable enough in the role. I mean, he's doing the guest shot and everything. And he was doing better with... Well, also, he had better opportunities than Jackson did. He had more dialogue in even his few episodes in the second season than Jackson did in most of his episodes in the first.
Yeah, You're right. And that's unfortunately, we talked about this before. Jackson's suggestions about including the Captain Marvel character more often were used. They were used.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, it was not him who was doing it.
Right.
You know, Isis, I'm beginning to think that Andrea's afraid of you. I mean, you are pretty rough competition for a woman.
Really? What would you think of Captain Marvel as competition for a man?
Cindy and Carrie, why don't I give you a ride home?
As an adult, I'm looking at this, I'm going, whoa! Whoa! What are we supposed to make of that? Oh boy. Well, if this were Superman, it would be faster than a speeding bullet.
Yeah.
Oh boy. So, Rick hams it up by imitating Captain Marvel's hands on the hip look, which is nice. I thought Brian Cutler did good with that. I think that might have been Brian Cutler's idea. I don't know if that was in the script or not.
Right.
That might have been Brian Cutler's idea. But here's what I say. If Jackson would have played the part here, that would not have happened. Because Jackson would not have played the character with his hands on his hips.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. That would have been different. Because what John is doing is natural. The script doesn't call for him to put his hands on his hips. That's just natural. But Jackson was conscientious about not putting his hands on his hips because it looked too authoritarian. and he would not have done that in the scene and how it played out. But I thought that this ends really well. I thought that the touch of humor at the end with Brian Cutler as Rick Mason walking off like that, I thought that was great.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I agree. It was funny. It was pretty funny as he walks away with Cindy and such. That was pretty funny. And leaving the closing shot with Isis and Captain Marvel looking on.
Although looking on, the closing shot, the reaction shot, is really cheesy. Okay. This kid's going to end up in juvie for stealing a boat and making a false distress call to the Coast Guard. Let's smile.
But that happened with a few of the other shows as well, with Shazam and such at the end. It's like, you've still got troubles ahead. Now let's make a dumb joke.
And as we end the review of this episode, you notice that the proper authorities were not called. Only the Coast Guard was the proper authority in this episode.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, that's the one thing. We don't have, like, police showing up or anything and taking Carrie away.
That would have been great.
Yeah.
Let this help your self-esteem as you spend the next 2 years in juvie. I would have paid good money to see something like that. Oh, that would have been good.
Well, let's take a moment here, talk about the stunts. We've been praising them here throughout the episode. There's quite a few. I mean, for Isis herself, there's the flying sequences where it's done just the way Jackson did back in the first season, and we get 2 landing shots of Isis, natural ones, one of them on a boat.
Yes, I thought the one on the boat was the best looking one.
Yeah.
Because after looking at this episode, it has to do with the editing. She jumped off of something to do the landing. I don't know if it was a ladder or what, but what makes it interesting to me is that the camera is head on facing her, not from an angle. If I'm interpreting the camera look correctly, or where it was positioned, it wasn't at an angle. I think it was head on. She jumped off of something to simulate a landing.
Right.
And that's still, whether it's 1 feet or 2 feet, that's still kind of high up when you're wearing shoes like that. And you have to be very careful as an actor not to hurt yourself. And I thought she did fine. I consider that a stunt.
Definitely.
Let's not forget John Davies' stunt here. He jumped into the water in full costume as Captain Marvel.
Yeah. Yeah, no, it was really well done, all the stunts in this. It's part of what made this feel like a first season episode.
Yes. And this was a first season episode of Isis, of course.
Right.
And
first season of Captain Marvel, I should say.
Right, of Shazam. Yeah. Of course, this is what makes it feels like a first season episode of Shazam 2, like you just said, because it had organic stunts. It didn't always rely on blue screen or green screen.
Mm-hmm. Now, as far as the fashions, I've got to say I loved Cindy Lee's and Andrea's cute outfits while they were washing the boat.
Oh, you perv.
Yeah.
All right, I got to admit, I like them too. And that goofy hat and the dress that Carrie Anson wears, what the hey? Those things were weird.
Yeah.
I mean, Little House on the Prairie, weird, for 1976. Didn't work for me.
Well, she was probably drawing attention to herself.
You can draw attention to yourself in a positive way by attire. That's not, I suppose, negative attention to herself.
Right.
And this brings up the whole thing we've talked about before. And the end credits of Isis and Shazam, they always run those psychologist names, those 3 psychologist names at the very end,
right,
as consultants. Did they consult with any of those psychologists about a character like this?
I don't know.
That has me thinking of the whole psychologist thing, of why they consulted with these people in the first place, to try to get the mindset of someone, of the troubled teenager of the week that they're trying to write into an episode. We need to consult with a psychologist from USC.
Yeah.
What kind of a person can we put into our script? Oh, how about put in a person with low self-esteem? Make sure you put a goofy hat on her to draw attention to herself.
Yeah.
Wow.
We will return to Isis after these messages.
Here's just what you're looking for. The Price is Right. Now at 4 o'clock. And you've never seen anything like it. It's put-ons and take-offs and smashing prizes. So join Bob Barker for The Price is Right. Now at 4 each weekday afternoon here on Channel 2.
Listen, I want to tell you who we got this week. We've got Brett Summers, Charles Nelson Riley, Fannie Flagg, and
Bud Braverman.
And my gorgeous friend, Ava Gabor.
And the very handsome William Daly.
And we'll all be here on Match Game. Tune in, yeah.
I'm not sure about that.
And now, back to Isis.
You have to like and respect yourself. Each of us has many things we can be proud of. Things we can do as well, maybe even better than anyone else. So don't put yourself down. Being popular means caring about other people and yourself. See you next week.
So, the moral. We kind of got the beginning cut off. We have the audio as we played it, but basically it's you have to be liked and respect yourself. You have to like and respect yourself. Now, I've got to admit, I don't think this moral entirely matches the story. Because Carrie's obsessed with her looks. She's always talking about the blubber and and it's her looks that bring her down. She downplays the things she's really good at. Her sense of humor, her ability to lead. I mean, they had to convince her, but she, like you said, she probably had it in the back of her mind to run for student body president there. And it's because she thought she wasn't interesting enough because she wasn't pretty enough. And I think like if this were today and we were doing that episode, Isis would speak more to that because it would have been more relevant today because we hear so many stories still of body shaming and body issues.
Yeah, that's true. We hear stories about body shaming and body issues told to us by someone who works out 6 hours a day and knockout women who tell us about have high self-esteem. Don't let people put you down because of body shaming while they like knockouts, okay? There's a mixed message. Yeah, you're right. I think that Isis could have addressed both of those things. I think that they were in a rush and didn't combine the two. There was self-image issues, appearance, yes, the way a person looks, as well as talent and just not feeling good about oneself. And that was an important thing. Overall, I think the moral is relevant. I think that it did need to be supplemented a little bit more, as you say.
Yeah. Yeah. But despite all that, I think this episode holds up very well.
Yes, I do too. I think it was good.
Yeah. Now, let me ask you this. On our scale of 1 to 5 tuts, how would you rate Funny Gal?
I would rate 5 out of 5 tuts. We even have Tut playing an important part of the story.
That's true.
And with now 3 appearances of Isis, wasn't it?
No.
It was 2. It was 2. Okay, because I thought very quickly. No, there's 3. I'm mixing Captain Marvel's appearance in here with 2 appearances of 2 appearances of Isis, 1 appearance of Captain Marvel. We had a lot of superhero action in just a 25-minute story or less.
Right.
Now, what's interesting here? John Davey got single screen billing as the guest star, special guest star John Davey.
Right.
That's probably the only time in his career that this has happened. To be special guest star. His career has been very extensive because he was in the Rockford Files. He was in Barnaby Jones. He appeared in movies. He was always a guest character playing somebody. And in the Rockford Files, he played at least 4 or 5 different kinds of characters. Usually a delivery man or something like that. And I tell John all the time that your old episodes of the Rockford Files are on Netflix. You should look them up. He's surprised to even know that, okay? But this is the only time in his career that he appeared as single-screen billing as a special guest star. That's kind of cool. Agents negotiate for this kind of stuff, you know.
Well, you wonder if his agent did that or if they just gave it to him because it made sense because he's the star of Shazam.
Yeah, that might be the case.
Yeah.
But again, I like the character and I like how John played it here really well. But part of me feels bad for Jackson because that would have been him had he not been fired.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, no, I agree. Despite that, though, I've got to say also 5 out of 5 tuts. I completely forgot that Marvel was in this episode. I knew that he was going to be doing an upcoming guest appearance, but I thought it was at the end of the season entirely. So this turned out to be a really nice addition. And it's interesting to note that Isis had to stay concentrated on the storm. I guess the storm was that big. It's not a simple matter of cast a spell and hold it in place and let me go take care of Carrie. She's literally holding back a major storm, which is also weird, though, because we get back to the shore and the storm never hits.
That's right. And I hadn't thought about that before, John. You're correct on that observation because in prior episodes of Isis, all she has to do is cast a spell and stop something or start something or whatever.
Right.
In this episode, she has to hold off the storm with effort. It's not as though her powers over earth, wind, fire, and everything else, and every other musical band you never heard.
I was wondering if you were going to say that.
It required concentration.
Yeah.
She had power over all the elements, and it took effort. I thought that was good. That was good. There's a limit to Isis's power.
There's a limit to Isis's power, but what I would have preferred is if they instead of saying a storm, maybe they kicked it up and made it seem a lot more violent, a hurricane or something. I don't know. Do you know what I mean?
Yes, I do know what you mean. But it was good because...
Oh, it was good.
It was great. It showed that she was not all-powerful.
No.
And that brings back the other thing about poor Lucky again. She couldn't stop death. And she could barely hold off a storm, John.
Yeah.
One last quick thing. It's not that important, but
okay.
For our fans of the podcast who have the Secrets of Isis on DVD, you bought the official versions. They're no longer being made, unfortunately, as we make this podcast. This episode, Funny Gal, is one of the few episodes on the DVD where they separate the music from the dialogue. If you want to watch this episode and hear the music only without dialogue, I don't understand why you want to do that. But you can if you want to. That feature is on here.
I liked it, but I also didn't like it because at the same time I'm thinking I want to hear the music, not the sound effects, because they kept the sound effects.
That's right. With music and effects.
Yeah.
I don't know the rationale why they did that.
Well, it just may have not been easy to separate those tracks. That's the only thing I can think of.
But why would they even have a separate feature where you have the music and effects without the dialogue? I've never heard of a DVD feature that had that before. It's possible. I don't know why you'd want to do that for.
Maybe they thought that someday some weird producer of a podcast on Shazam and Isis would get it in his head that maybe we could do an audio drama on the final Captain Marvel story.
Do we have a new assignment in our future?
You know I've had that in the back of my head. What if we could get Jackson or John and Michael Gray to just do voices like they did in the Dungeons and Dragons DVD edition and the Lost in Space with their final stories, that we could do an audio drama of the final story of Billy getting back to his city with the RV and Mentor. And I've got the perfect person to cast as Mentor.
Oh, perfect. That would be great if they gave us music to do it with. That's awesome.
See what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Maybe they thought that. Maybe.
Maybe they thought that, and we would have to not worry about copyright clearances or whatnot. If they really wanted to add a cool feature on here, I think they should have just given some reasonable compensation to both Joanna Cameron, to Brian Cutler, and to Joanna Payne Atkins, and even to John Davey. Bring them all together, and let's talk about the episode and how they did it and what they remember about it. That would have been cool.
Yeah.
We're not treated to that on this DVD. We do have commentaries on episodes in the DVD set, but not by the actors, not by anybody reminiscing scene by scene how they shot this, how they did this, what was the struggle what was the difficulty, what they enjoyed about it. We were not treated to that, unfortunately. I wish we would have.
No, I agree. Yeah, I definitely agree. Well, that's going to do it for this episode of the Shazam Isis podcast. Next time, we have a girl driver who competes for the presidency of the school's car club, and she's got a male rival's jealousy that could put them all in danger in the episode Girl Driver. Pretty simple episode title.
Pretty episode. It's going to be a pretty interesting episode, to say the least. I'm hoping that our podcast audience tunes in next time to hear it. It's going to be a good one.
Yeah, no, I agree. So until next time, folks, thank you so much for listening. Once again, Richard, everyone, take care.
Take care, and like us on Facebook and follow us on Twitter.